VJ brought an end to the Second World War. There's often some debate about how it ended with the two atomic explosions. Really, if those bombs hadn't been dropped, then the war would have gone on for some time to come, and it would have had greater casualties and greater consequences. So the war took the course that it did. People were very relieved that the war was over, because the war in the Far East is sometimes forgotten about as well. And there were a lot of people, a lot of casualties of that war in the Far East. There were a lot of people who were in prison camps. Many of whom didn't come back from the prison camps because of the treatment by the Japanese in the prison camps. And some of them that did come back didn't come back the same people that had left. So it was a very brutal chapter of the war, and for many people it's sort of forgotten that the Burma campaign and the Far East is seen as a forgotten war for many of the men that fought there, because I think it was so far away. And again, as Jim alluded to, or David alluded to, about the submarines, people didn't really talk too much about what had happened to them afterwards. There was a sort of a psychosis almost about what had happened, so that had an impact on it too. But VJ was a cause of celebration because the war was finally over, and the totalitarian states that had been battling against the democratic world effectively had been defeated. So Germany was defeated, Italy was defeated, and Japan was defeated by it. I wanted to take us back a wee bit in time then to Larne 75 years ago, because on the 17th of August, not too far away from this date, 1945, people in Larne had a bit of a celebration. It wasn't an official one, but it was down in the Victoria Hall in Larne on the Curran Road. And it was a special event. It was a concert and a dance, and one of the people who performed there, and I'm sure he wasn't as good a singer as Jim is, by the way, but his name was Bob Davids, and Bob was a well-known singer, well-known artist, but well-known in Belgium, which is where he was from. So many of the Belgian soldiers that were here were excellent musicians. They had dance bands, and their music, the calibre of their music was very, very clear to people who heard it here. A lot of them were volunteers. They'd volunteered for the military then once Belgium was liberated. So he was one of the people who was here. He was Private Bob Davids, and he took part in this concert. And also taking part was a mixed choir of local ladies and Belgian soldiers who sung mostly in Flemish, and I'm sure that was quite an experience to get used to the Flemish language and so on here. There was also a wee girl called Nan Sloan, and she sang a song on her own. It was a song called Workshop Song, which was the Flemish equivalent of She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, and she sang it, 6 verses of it in Flemish without once faltering. Now I'm not sure if Jim's going to try this later on, I don't know, he hasn't told me that, so but it struck me that Nan Sloan could still be around. I don't know what her name might be now, but at that stage she was a little girl, so she could still be alive today. It would have been 75 years ago when this all happened. And afterwards there was a dance in the Victoria Hall. There was a Belgian dance band from Ballycarry came down and provided entertainment. And the Belgians thanked, through one of the interpreters, one of the soldiers who could speak English, the commanding officer, thanked the people of Larne for how they'd been received and looked after when they were here. And I know the stories, there's some stories in our area of how when the soldiers came, they really were refugees effectively. They didn't have boots and they didn't have proper uniform and anything like that. And I was told that when they came down the street in Ballycarry, gradually they were taken into houses as they came down, and they were sort of adopted by local families and kitted out and so forth. And the Belgian forces didn't forget that. My microphone's gone away now, so I have to try and shout. So a lot of those soldiers came back in later life, and certainly last year I met a lady and her husband at the Goblins on the cliff path, and she was the daughter of one of the Belgian soldiers who'd been here. So there's still a sort of sense of connection, the Second World War, because of how they were received here and looked after during the times that they were here. And of course they were training to go back. There had been a Belgian resistance, like the French resistance. They had carried on the war against the Nazis in Belgium. But once Belgium was liberated, then these brigades were formed that I talked about earlier. So that event was happening. There was lots of other events in Larne as well. More official events then in the town, in the upper Main Street area of the town. They had a big celebration there, and there was open air dancing and so on. and lots of areas around had bonfires and dances and so on to celebrate the end of the war. Larne Harbour was opened to the public for the first time in 6 years in 1945, and people could see a new dock when they went in. They could see a new dock that had been built for the military, because Larne had been a very significant base, as we said earlier. And there was a service of Thanksgiving in Larne Town Park. 8,000 people attended it. It was addressed by a man called Reverend Alan Buchanan, who was known as the Parachute Padre, and he had been a minister at St Sedmus Church in Larne before he moved elsewhere, and then he joined the Parachute Regiment in the war. He was a prisoner of war in Europe for some time, and was quite a famous individual. And that day, the parade to the town park, I noted the bands. There were 3 bands that led the parade, and 2 of them were from Mackramore. So there was Mackramore Brass and Reed Band, Mackramore Park Flute Band, and Killyglen Flute Band were the bands that were out that day. There was a lot of presence of the Navy, Royal Navy presence, and the Belgian Army presence, and so on in the parade. So it must have been quite something to see at that particular time. So that was some of the things that happened in Larne for VE and VJ, and the commemoration of everything. The war itself, there are some landmarks. We can't cover everything in the short time, but for me some of the landmarks include Dunkirk, which almost saw the defeat of the British Army and could have meant the defeat of Britain during the war. Had the army, the expeditionary force, not been brought back as safely as possible, then there would have been no British army effectively. It would have been on the beaches in France, and that would have been the end of it. The Germans had a plan called Operation Sea Lion, and Operation Sea Lion was about the invasion of the United Kingdom. So they had the photographs of Larne Harbour, the photographs of everywhere they could find, and the photographs were taken by Luftwaffe during peacetime, before the war broke out, when they were operating in and out of the airports with Lufthansa planes, and those photographs were then passed to the Luftwaffe. The plan was there. The plan was to invade via Aldergrove, where the airport was, the RAF base, to bring in crack commando troops in there, and then spread out, cut the railway communications and the road communications, and then take over Northern Ireland. Also invade the south, which was a neutral country, but the Germans didn't really respect neutrality too much, so they planned to invade there as well. One thing stopped that, and that was the Battle of Britain. If the Battle of Britain had been lost, if the RAF had been destroyed as was intended, then the invasion would have followed very soon after that. All the preparations had taken place in France. The Germans had lots of barges to bring over their heavy equipment, their tanks, everything else, and it would have centred on the south coast of England. There might have been a diversion in Scotland, and there might have been a diversion south of Dublin to spread the attention at the time, but it was a very clear danger that was going to happen. Because the RAF wasn't destroyed, then that meant the invasion never occurred. And the last line of defence, we all laugh about it now, I'm sure everybody's watched Dad's Army from time to time. That was the last line of defence when the invasion came. And the men in the Home Guard were trained to make Molotov cocktails, they were trained to block roads, they were trained to take down the signposts, and to be a guerrilla war, operate a guerrilla war effectively. The royal family were to be evacuated to Canada, the gold bullion was to go to Canada, so this was all very, very, very real. And to me, I don't think we really realised just how close we were to that happening, and thankfully it didn't, and we know the outcome of the war. Northern Ireland was extremely significant. 140 warships were built in Belfast in 4 years, and 10% of the merchant ships that were built during the war were built in Belfast. So that was very significant. 1,200 Sterling bombers were produced at Short's factory in Belfast as well, and 75 million shells were produced in munitions factories here in this part of the world. Carrick had a tank factory. If any of you go up the Marine Highway, you probably see the tank there, symbolises the tank factory in Carrick, and also a parachute factory as well. And 250,000 tonnes of rope produced in Belfast Rope Works for the war effort, and 90% of the army shirts for the British Army made in Northern Ireland during the Second World War. So that's a big, 90% is a big, big number. So it was very significant. That's away from all the aspects of the geographical location and the military and the naval and the air force aspects of it too. And Larne Harbour, just to throw a few wee figures at you from Larne Harbour. Between July 1940 and June 1944, 92,000 vehicles and 4 million military personnel went through Larne Harbour in those years. So that gives you some idea of the extent of importance of Larne Harbour. One of the movements of troops was coming into the country when the Americans arrived here. The 1st US Armoured Division, 200 tanks of the 1st US Armoured Division rumbled along the Curran Road after landing at Larne, and that must have been some sight to see. You can imagine what that would have been like. So the port was a very significant place. There were anti-aircraft guns. We didn't call it. Margaret Hume told me how the anti-aircraft guns were down the road on the Valley Pollard Road there, heading down towards the Paith. There were anti-aircraft guns there, and of course down near the harbour and elsewhere as well at that particular time. Wanted to mention a few people because history is about individuals as well as events, and if you can't grasp the sort of wider story, then the individual tells you what it was really like. So just a few people I wanted to mention to you. Martha Adair was a nurse, and she was from Ballycarry. She was parachuted behind enemy lines in Burma in January 1945 with other nurses, and they set up clearing stations for a big offensive that took place. So how brave was that, to go behind enemy lines in advance of all of that. A family called the Rileys. They're not from here, they're from Limavady, and there were 9 Riley brothers who served in the Canadian forces in the Second World War. They came over here at one point when the Canadian forces came here. Presbyterian Moderator met them, and the Grand Master of the Orange Order met them as well, because they were involved in both those. And they all survived the war. Their descendants live in Wellington, Ontario today. But that must be a record, because there's a famous film produced about an Irish-American family called the Fighting Sullivans. Has anybody heard of the Fighting Sullivans? Well, there were 5 Sullivan brothers in the US Navy during the war. But the fact there were 9 Ulster soldiers in the Canadian Army must be a record, I think, and something to remember. In Larne, there are 2 men who have a rather unusual name as well, and their surname is Benugli. One was called Giuseppe, or Pepe Benugli he was called. He had a shop in Larne, and they lived in Whitehead before that. And his brother was called Fred, which doesn't sound quite as Italian. But they both joined up, and when they were going to Europe, they had to be given false identities, because if they'd been captured, they'd have been shot outright, because they would have been seen as Italians and traitors. Pepe Benugli and Fred both survived the war, both served with distinction, and Pepe received a Belgian award, a medal from the Belgian government for his efforts as well. 2 Macramore men, a Captain William R. Burns, was awarded the OBE in 1942 for brave conduct with the Merchant Navy in 1945 on the convoys. And Captain James Foster of Macramore took part in the D-Day landings, and he fought off 3 German aircraft in the Bristol Channel on his ship, the Baroncourt. And he also rescued 14 Norwegian seamen and was awarded an MBE in 1941 for that. And John Gracie, from Quinton's Avenue, or Quinton's Cottages, he was lost at sea. Many merchantmen from this area, and he was one of them. He was survived by his wife and 3 children in 1942. And a happier story, another lady from Macramore, Agnes Ray O'Toole. She was the daughter of Michael O'Toole, and she was married to an intelligence officer in the US Army in 1948, and that took place in Germany, in Marburg in Germany. And so she was one of the GI brides from this area that went across to America after the war, and had a life then in America as well. So, just a few things to round off. Thinking particularly of VJ, we talked about the people in the prison camps. And the Lilly family from Larne, they lost 2 sons. One of them was lost in Europe with the RAF, and the second died as a prisoner of war in a Japanese prison camp. The Lilly family received the news of both their deaths within 1 month at the end of the Second World War. Wilson was the second who died in the prison camp, and he worked at Ralug Dairy prior to joining up at the age of 18 in 1940, and he died then in 1945 in Sarawak POW camp. So I think it's important that we celebrate, and we also remember those that didn't come back and those that were affected by the war. It must have been a very traumatic time for the people who were at home, and for everybody that was taking part, because this was an unbelievable evil that had been unleashed in the Second World War through Nazism and fascism. And had the Nazis succeeded, then it would have been a very different world, as we know, and many people would never have seen that world because of the philosophy that they had. We have a lot to be proud about in Northern Ireland because of our role and because of the men that served and the women that served in different ways in the military and the navy and elsewhere. And we're also right to be proud that we made a fitting home for people who, like the Belgians, were effective refugees and were trained here and learned here to go back into Europe. And also American troops. In 1944, 1 in 10 people in Northern Ireland was American. Because there were so many Americans here, both with the military and with the navy, and also with intelligence. And in Fermanagh, it was 1 in 4 was American. 1 in 4 people you'd have bumped into would have been American because of that. A very unique American regiment called the US Rangers still exists today, and it's a Special Forces regiment, a commando regiment, and it was formed in Carrickfergus in June 1942. The first battalions were formed here, and other battalions then were formed back in the United States. But the first battalions that were formed here trained in Carrick, and they trained in the areas around. They had a speed march, and they marched very, very fast. That was one of their signatures, that they could move without vehicles very, very quickly. They took their name, Rangers, from a man called Rogers, who was an Ulster Scot who went to America during the colonial period and formed a militia in the mountains. And when the Americans were under pressure from Indian attacks and so on, Rogers Rangers protected the settlements. So whenever the US Army decided to form commandos in Northern Ireland in 1942, they took the name of this man from Northern Ireland, Rogers, as an inspiration, and they called the new unit the Rangers after him. And the US Rangers still exists today. When they're being trained, they're told that they were born in Northern Ireland, that's where they come from, and they're told the history of the connections here, which I think is pretty awesome. And they've seen service, needless to say, in places like the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq and so on in more recent times. Some of them I know come to the Rangers Centre at Carrickfergus. Some of them met retired Rangers, because that's a museum for the regiment. And the last of the Rangers who joined up in Carrick sadly died last week. Very old man. So that draws a close to the chapter of the Rangers, but still the connections would remain, that they were formed here, and they trained over in Scotland, and then they saw service in North Africa and Italy. The units were badly wiped out in Italy, and new battalions were formed, and they saw service in Normandy landings and in the Philippines as well, and they were really impressive units as well. So that's something of a potted run around history of the Second World War, and the connections that this area has and the connections Northern Ireland has with it. Skimmed over a lot of history, but I hope you've got something from it as well, and I hope you're able to hear me okay as well too. Jim's going to come back in a wee minute and sing for you. But I think one thing to remember is that we should all be very, very proud of the contribution Northern Ireland made during the Second World War, and the contribution that the forces of the democratic countries made during the war, because they helped to protect the world as it was at that time. Maybe it wasn't the perfect world, but it's a much better world than it would have been if Hitler had won and if the Japanese had continued to struggle then. So, I don't know if Jim's going to sing in Flemish to you. No? Oh, maybe next time. Are you going to sing a wee bit more now, are you?
No.
That's it? Okay. Well, that seems to be it, folks. So, thank you very much for your attention. And I hope you've enjoyed the day generally, and I hope you've enjoyed the camp activities as well. So, thanks.